college. Physicists at Los Alamos began the consisted of a pile in which a fission reaction could be initiated and controlled.
They did it by piling layers of graphite and then embedding balls of uranium, so that when the neutrons started flying through, they would be slowed by the graphite, collide with the uranium, release more neutrons, and those neutrons would continue in the chain reaction pattern.
This momentous achievement, only detectable by a Geiger counter, meant that the fission process could be sustained. Nuclear energy could be released in a controlled way, as in a reactor, or perhaps cataclysmically, as in a bomb.
This in no way indicates that an explosive chain reaction is achievable.
To head up the installation, Groves, an expert judge of men, chose a most unlikely candidate, J. Robert Oppenheimer. A gifted physics professor, Oppenheimer had a reputation for being temperamental, perhaps not suited to a highly stressful assignment.
It was advised that Oppenheimer would be a disaster. People told him that Oppenheimer couldn't run a hot dog stand.
Oppenheimer was a fascinating and complicated man. Fundamentally, he seems to have had some of the qualities of an actor. He was different things to different people.
Oppenheimer drew luminaries like Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, and Edward Teller to the facility, as well as technicians fresh out of college. During the fall of 1942, the theoretical physicists at Los Alamos began the difficult process of trying to determine how much U-235 it would take to make a bomb.
And the scientists tell him, well, it could be X amount, but that's plus or minus by a factor of 10. Groves is absolutely staggered. He uses the illustration that, well, you're giving a wedding, and you say it's for 100 people, but maybe 1,000 will turn up, or maybe 10. So how can you make any sort of plans?
Robert Oppenheimer's team of physicists doubled the amount of uranium-235 thought necessary to achieve critical mass and sustain an explosive chain reaction to 200 kilograms. Their calculation, made without adequate samples of U-235 for tests, would prove to be 10 times the required amount.
It was important that the critical mass was not too small. That would make nuclear bombs too cheap and easy to make. But equally it was important that the critical mass was not too large, as this would make deliverable bombs an impossibility.
The main obstacle was how to quickly assemble two smaller subcritical masses into one larger explosive one. The bomb design that they came up with was a gun design. Inside the bomb, a cannon would fire one piece of radioactive fuel into another at 3,000 feet per second. The pieces would have to come together fast enough to prevent spontaneously emitted neutrons from melting the fuel, causing the bomb to fizzle rather than explode.
But the engineering aspects were daunting. It's one thing to say you can shoot a piece of uranium at a second piece, but how do you do it? How fast does it have to go? How do you stop it at the end? How do you keep it together long enough as a mass so that it does go high order and give you an atomic bomb?
The scientists at Los Alamos also studied tampers, barrier materials that would slow the expansion of the critical mass and reflect neutrons back to feed the fission process inside the bomb. On December 28, 1942, President Roosevelt approved an additional $500 million investment in the Manhattan Project. The first priority, to build the massive industrial facilities that would produce the fissionable material to fuel the atom bomb.
Though they wanted people to believe a nuclear explosion was possible, it was also important that not just anyone could do it, that it was not replicable without extreme cost, and so they would make the nuclear fuel as difficult to make as possible. There is also a huge profit motive for doing this. There are vast sums of money to be made from supposed nuclear fuel, from its production and from its protection, transportation and storage before and after use.
These gigantic structures contained multiple calutrons, box-shaped collection units that were configured in a racetrack layout. A magnetic field passed throughout the entire oval of calutrons, causing the divergence of streams of U-235 and U-238, so that the separated isotopes could be collected. A single calutron could capture a mere 10 grams of U-235 daily. A staggering total of 1,152 would be built by war's end. Because of the intense time constraints, Groves could not afford to build pilot plants, facilities to test the scaling up of the laboratory processes.
They're physically building Oak Ridge and Y12, the electromagnetic separation plant, before the design drawings had even been approved. And it's incredible that you would never do this.
Groves was not content to rely on just two approaches, Y12 and Hanford, to produce the weapons-grade fuel for the bomb. By September 1943, he had begun construction on a third, K-25, a gigantic gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge. In the diffusion process, a gaseous compound, uranium hexafluoride, passes through a cascade of barriers, each one giving a slight enrichment of the lighter isotope U-235. The difficulty lay in finding a barrier that would not be degraded by the very corrosive gas. Scientists and engineers were not able to manufacture a satisfactory barrier until a year after site construction began on K-25. A building that would ultimately cover more area than any structure ever built. The U-shape measured half a mile long by 1,000 feet wide. With an area of 2 million square feet, it contained a series of sealed containers and cascades that ran the length of the building.
If anybody asks you what you make in Oak Ridge, you tell them you're making the lights for the lightning bugs, or that you're making the holes for the donuts.
Huge industrial facilities were commissioned and built without any significant evidence a deliverable bomb was possible. There always was doubt that nuclear fuel could be produced in sufficient quantities whilst maintaining a pure product.
Fission is more readily produced in a rare uranium isotope, uranium-235, that occurs naturally at a ratio of 1 to 139 to its less useful twin, uranium-238. Chemically identical, the isotopes were almost impossible to separate. The only workable method in 1942 was electromagnetic separation. In this process, a mass spectrometer used for separating electrically charged particles according to their mass sent a stream of uranium atoms past a magnet. Atoms of the lighter isotope U-235 would be deflected more than those of the heavier U-238 and would be captured one atom at a time. Scientists at Columbia University championed a competing mode of separation, gaseous diffusion. This method passed the isotope through a porous barrier that separated the lighter isotope from its heavier counterpart, but it proved to be technically challenging.
In a square centimeter, about the size of a thumbnail, you've got to have hundreds of millions of pores, and they have to all be the same size. If they're too big, the gas flows through without any separation. If they're too small, the gas gets in there and condenses on the surface, won't go through. So you talk about obstacles.
But if a suitable barrier could be manufactured, it promised a greater yield than the electromagnetic process. Both techniques would have to be done on a massive scale.
This could well all be an entirely fraudulent exercise that takes uranium and turns it into expensive uranium. This can be done simply by changing the label.
A new man-made element, plutonium, was gaining favor as a possible fuel. Identified in 1941, plutonium was almost twice as likely to undergo fission as uranium-235 and could be produced on a large scale by irradiating uranium in nuclear reactors. In order to produce plutonium, 3 production reactors were designed by engineers at the University of Chicago that would be built in Hanford, Washington. Groves initiated the construction at Hanford on August 27, 1943.
Though plutonium may exist in theory, it is likely that it can only be produced in trace quantities and not in sufficient quantity or purity to establish what its attributes are, nor in that which would be required for a bomb. The qualities of plutonium are highly convenient. Not only is it highly fissionable, but also castable and machinable. These qualities were improved by alloying plutonium with gallium, though other elements were tried. Gallium also supposedly lowers the susceptibility of plutonium to corrosion.
The isotope we produced was plutonium-238, produced by the deuteron bombardment of uranium. Then a month later, joined by Emilio Segre, we identified in this room the isotope of importance, plutonium-239, and isolated it so that it could be have its fission properties measured at the 37-inch cyclotron.
But Hanford depended as much on chemical separation as it did on the reactors. The chemistry was Glenn Seaborg's, massively scaled up from his University of Chicago team's ultra-microchemical work.
We had been working with what you call tracer amounts, invisible amounts detected by its radioactivity, but we couldn't deduce the chemical properties with certainty that way. We needed to work with actual ponderable, weighable amounts, and that's why we produced weighable amounts of plutonium in this way. This meant that we had to work, I say we, are the chemists working with me, on what they call an ultra-microchemical scale.
It was looking less and less likely that enough U-235 could be produced to impact the war. At the same time, the alternative, plutonium, was proving to be equally tricky. Impurities in this new element were leading to increased neutron activity that would cause bombs to pre-detonate, to fizzle before the two halves joined in a critical mass.
There are production problems at Oak Ridge. They're not sure they can even make any uranium at that point, uranium-235. And so if they can't use plutonium in a gun, there may in fact not even be an atomic bomb.
It's a real crisis. It's at that point that I think Oppenheimer's talent comes to the fore, where he brings in the people, new people in fact, and he reorganizes Los Alamos.
Scientists and dignitaries awaited the detonation of the first atomic bomb in a desolate area of the New Mexico desert, known aptly as Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death. They had taken bets on how much power their creation might unleash, but many wondered whether the weapon would work at all.
But as the test date drew closer, there was a nagging uncertainty about whether the bomb would actually work at all. In a meeting before the test, Hans Bethe described all that was known about the bomb, and what wasn't.
Litchfield and I overruled Fermi, and that is a very dangerous thing to do, because Fermi was almost always right, but we overruled him. And so I felt uncertain for that reason.
What was thought of during the war was, and very often we kept saying, maybe we'll come across some insuperable physical obstacle which prevents it from working. You can easily imagine those things. For example, a little delay in the emission of fast neutrons after fission.
Norman Ramsey bet low.
And I bet zero, and I think that was the most intelligent bet of any, because zero included not only zero, but it also included the first 25 generations of neutrons. I mean, this is an exponentially growing thing, so it's probably the first 35 generations of neutrons. If it stopped anywhere along there, it would be zero in the scale that they had. So I had the biggest number of, statistically, the best chance of winning.
Very hard to sleep, very hard to get your minds off all the things that might have gone wrong, very hard not to think about the implications. But, you know, we were consumed with the job, especially this crucial one, a test fire to see if this whole idea would work. And that was in everyone's mind, I think.
Everybody was extremely excited to see if it actually would turn out to be that way, because no one really knew whether the thing would work or not.
It was determined that explosive means would do the job by taking a subcritical mass and making it critical, so the radioactive material would detonate. Two methods to do that had been devised. One was a gun method, where two halves of subcritical material were shot together to form the critical mass, starting the nuclear detonation. It was discovered the gun method would work with uranium, but not with plutonium. The gun method was the easiest, but the science of implosion would have to be developed also. It required science and engineering that would enable simultaneous and uniform compression of plutonium. Because nothing like this had ever been created,